Hello, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. Here I am in St Mary's Woolnoth Church in London, the City of London, the financial district. Anyway, I'm here because this is the church where the author of Amazing Grace was rector. So that's John Newton, who was born in Wapping, a part of London not very far from here, in 1725 into a middle-class family. But he went to sea when he was about 19, and he was a sailor, but he was highly literate, so he rose up the ranks quite quickly, quite mathematical. They had to be able to navigate by the stars back then. And he served 9 years before the mast, eventually becoming captain at a relatively young age, and it was quite a handsomely paid occupation. So this was the mid-18th century, and it was really the height of the transatlantic slave trade. So Britons, as well as other Europeans, Spaniards, Frenchmen, the Dutch, the Portuguese, were going to the coast of West Africa and purchasing people. So African countries are often at war against each other, and those who were defeated were taken captive, and the luckless captives were often sold into servitude. So they'd been thralled in West Africa throughout history, so far as we know, though they say the exploitation had not been quite so intense. So there's an absolutely murderous trade in human flesh. People who were not thought to be physically fit, unlike to survive the voyage, were promptly murdered, and those who were thought to be able to survive, chained up and put onto the slave ships in the most inhumane conditions. Obviously not allowed to go elsewhere when they had to answer a call of nature, so the stench from below deck must have been absolutely overpowering. Several weeks' voyage across the ocean, and many people perished on that voyage, sometimes brought onto the deck once a day to be doused in seawater as some sort of measure of hygiene, and forced to dance for sort of exercise. And many of those who died en route had their corpses unceremoniously flung overboard to the sharks. So it was ghastly. But anyway, he took part in this barbaric, gruesome trade for several years. But in 1748, once a tempest brewed up, and he feared for his life. So he prayed to the Almighty that if he was spared, he would be a zealous Christian beforehand. He was a nominal Anglican, not terribly serious up until that point. But anyway, it was only some years later that he really became evangelical, and Christianity became the absolute center of his life. And he began to reflect on what he'd been doing on transporting people into a life of the most hellish toil in the Caribbean and in North America. And began to think this was perhaps sinful. Well, yes, so it definitely was iniquitous, and he turned against it, and he became a real apostle of anti-slavery. So he worked in Liverpool for a while as inspector of the tide, some sort of port captain position, and later he undertook theological studies in Liverpool and elsewhere. He was then ordained into the Church of England and was eventually given a pulpit, that pulpit to be more exact. So he would stand up there and preach, and you can see that sort of sounding board above him, because that would cause the sound to reverberate, because there was no sound system in those days, of course. And he held a number of benefices. Eventually, this was his parish, a very desirable and handsomely remunerated parish in the financial district, with a lot of well-heeled parishioners, although it's not a very large church. If I give you the 360-degree views, I mean, how many people could sit in these pews? Not a lot. I mean, a couple of hundred at most. So people actually used to live in this area. Almost nobody lives here now, because they're just banks, stock exchange with the stock exchange, and insurance houses, a few solicitors' firms, accountancy firms. The Bank of England is across the street. But anyway, so he lived high in the hog, but he realized that he had committed the most atrocious crimes on a prolific scale. He estimated that he'd had transported about 10,000 people into servitude, who were then toiling under the broiling sun, under the lash, from dawn till dusk in America and in the Antilles. So he tried to undo some of the horrendous damage that he had wrought, and he began disseminating the plain truth about the cruelties of slavery. Anyway, so he crusaded against this satanic evil, really going on a speaking tour, trying to be politically active. He became friends with William Wilberforce, that Tory MP for Hull. Wilberforce was from a wealthy timber trading family, and this really became the pole star of Wilberforce's life. And in 1787, they founded the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade. Now, Thomas Clarkson also joined this group. Clarkson had been at Cambridge, and he'd been set an essay, Anne Liciat in Vito Servitatem Dare, meaning, is it permissible to enslave the unconsenting? Although that seems to be tautological to me, because if someone is consenting, then it can't be servitude. Now, this had been something which caught Clarkson's intellectual fantasy, but he became intrigued by the issue and decided that it was a moral outrage. It was repulsive to kidnap someone and take him or her across ocean's tide and force this person to work without an ob in compensation, and subject them to all manner of unspeakable tortures for years to wring every last drop out of value out of this person. It was evil. So the satanic sadism of slavery was starting to come home to people in this country. I know it was a fairly violent time. Parents beating their children heavily was permissible. Employers would sometimes beat their employees. Employees who left their job without permission were guilty of a civil wrong and so on in those days. So it was a grossly inegalitarian society. And actually Wilberforce was quite an inegalitarian. He thought that the upper orders should rule. He was certainly an anti-revolutionary and didn't recognize that some of the proletariat in this country were held in semi-servitude as it was. But anyway, they slowly began the parliamentary campaign, and they actually managed to persuade the House of Commons to vote against the slave trade. Not against slavery itself, but the trade. Abducting people in Africa and conveying them overseas was to be outlawed. But the House of Lords, fulfilling its dignified function as a second revising chamber to oppose populist nonsense and things which are ill thought through, voted it down and prolonged the slave trade by half a century. Not by half a century, by about 20 years. But the slave trade itself was abolished in 1807. The United States followed suit the following year. That's a transatlantic trade. Selling one person from one plantation to the next was still allowed, or indeed one colony to the next, even in the New World, or people within India could be sold. They were almost always sold by Indians, though, back then. But you could no longer take people from Africa to other continents. There's obviously in 1833, a law was passed to outlaw the slave trade to be phased out over 5 years. Supposedly they would be apprentices for 5 years, and they would be prepared for liberty. Eventually it was brought forward slightly, and they were freed in 1837. But there were some exemptions. Some areas of the British Empire wasn't to be abolished. There's a lot of talk about compensation for slavery these days, and indeed it was paid, but to the masters, not to the victims of slavery. Over £20 billion, a very tidy sum. It's shocking that that was paid, of course, but then they wouldn't have been able to get it through Parliament if they hadn't done that. And the biggest single recipient was Sir John Gladstone's, as in the father of the Prime Minister, William Ewart Gladstone, who owned over 2,000 people, mostly in Trinidad. Anyway, it was Amazing Grace was the hymn which John Newton composed, and it was first revealed to the public here on New Year's Day, 1788, if I got that right. So it became a Negro spiritual and a staple of the anti-slavery movement. You can see the Decalogue here, okay, inscribed for all to read. And I can't see what the lectern is. The Church of England usually has an eagle symbol on the lectern. So there's the organ above. Anyway, it's a very fine church, I think you'll agree. They're not terribly well lit. So that's enough from me. So please follow my channel and follow me on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and so forth. So I hope you found this somewhat informative. You can see the film Amazing Grace, which is about Wilberforce and the abolition of the slave trade. It stars John Finney, who plays the role of John Newton, the one who composed the lyrics to Amazing Grace. Right, that's enough from me. So thank you, everybody. Goodbye.